is in the embarrassment of a congressional presidential team that clearly is incapable of doing anything competent. And I say this on behalf of a bipartisan failure in Washington. The idea of passing a 2-month tax provision represents about as big a collapse of competence in Washington, I think, as we've seen in my lifetime. And the idea that they then went home, as opposed to staying until they got it right, tells you everything you need to know. But I want to share with you for a minute what I'm really surprised by. And I got to this because we went back and looked in my archives for a variety of things, because there have been arguments bubbling up about tax cuts versus tax increases. And I was surprised, I shouldn't have been, I guess, as a history teacher, but I was surprised to realize we're back at the same argument. In the late 1970s, when I first ran for Congress, the economy was a mess. We had an incumbent president who didn't understand what was going on. We had a rising price of gasoline. Some of you remember, we had gasoline rationing, where you bought gasoline every other day based on the last number of your life. How many of you remember this model? My friend David Bossie reminded me that he was 13 that year. And he knew about it because every morning his father would send him out with a screwdriver to change the license plates so that the car that needed gasoline had the right license plate. And I developed from that a test for being a liberal or a conservative. If we have a rule that is so dumb we're teaching 13-year-olds how to get around it, conservatives would suggest dropping the rule. Hearing that story, a good liberal would suggest that we need license plate police at every single gas station. Remember what a mess it was in 79, 80? 13% inflation rate, 22% interest rates, rising unemployment. And a number of us were active in that period. One of the folks who was a very young activist in that era is here with us today, Peter Ferrara, who came out, who's been one of the great developers of supply-side economics. And as a young candidate for Congress in 1978, a key part of my campaign was what was called supply-side economics. The idea was very simple. If you have incentives to increase the supply, you mop up the inflation because you're producing more goods and services. So if gasoline prices are the highest they've ever been, which they are, the average price of gasoline in 2011 is the highest in American history. But that doesn't affect the New York Times editorial board who rides subways. But it affects everybody in small town and rural America. It affects the price of everything that is delivered by truck. It inhibits economic development. It slows down manufacturing. And the answer, we thought, in the late 70s was to develop policies that would increase manufacturing, increase jobs, increase the supply of goods and services. Jack Kemp was our political leader. Jude Wanniski, Art Laffer, and others were key intellectuals in this development. And I was one of the early activists. In 1980, we convinced the former governor of California, to make it a centerpiece of his campaign. And Ronald Reagan campaigned on the idea that we would change the economy with a strategy of 4 things: lower taxes, less regulation, more American energy, and being favorable to people who create jobs. In the Reagan years, it was extraordinarily successful. The economy turned around. We created 1,300,000 jobs in the month of August '83 alone. If you took the Reagan recovery and laid it on our current population, it'd be 25 million new jobs. Then people forgot it. There was a fight not just between the left and the right. There was a fight inside the Republican Party between those who were passionate about raising taxes. In 1982, Reagan was talked into a tax increase. I opposed it. Kemp and I led the fight against it. Reagan said it was a mistake. It was the biggest single mistake of his administration. In 1990, President Bush wanted to raise taxes. I opposed it. We had a huge fight. The majority of Republicans voted no. And this fight still goes on today. So it's not just Democrats, Republicans. There's an establishment wing of America that believes that you have to have bigger government, and to have bigger government you have to have higher taxes, and they do not understand the economic impact of their policies. And there is a conservative wing which, beginning with Kemp and Wanniski and Laffer and others in the 1970s, said, wait a second, really want is a bigger America. So I became Speaker in 1994, and we went back to the Reagan-Kemp supply-side model. We cut taxes, we cut regulations, we reformed welfare, the first major entitlement reform of your lifetime. 2 out of 3 people went to work or went to school. The number of children in poverty dropped to the lowest level in American history because their parents were working. It was tremendously successful. We passed the first tax cut in 16 years, and the largest capital gains tax cut in history, and guess what happened? Unemployment dropped to 4.2%. Because we took people off unemployment, off Medicaid, off public housing, off welfare, we then turned over here and they got jobs and paid taxes. The decline in federal spending, the rise in revenue, not by higher taxes, but by more workers, we balanced the federal budget for 4 straight years. Paid off $405 billion in debt. Now I find myself, and I think it's fascinating, because I've been around long enough, this is my 3rd try at this. Twice it's worked. We know, I mean, these are historic facts, and nobody doubts the facts. And by the way, I'll concede, Bill Clinton signed the bills. He gets to claim half the credit. It was a bipartisan effort. When you have a liberal Democrat in the White House, you're not going to get a tax cut through unless he signs it, unless your majorities are so big you can override his veto. And that was impractical. So I will be candid with all of you. I was effective. I actually got the deal done. So it wasn't 112% pure. But it worked. And we got a liberal Democrat to sign welfare reform. We got a liberal Democrat to sign tax cuts. We got a liberal Democrat to sign 4 consecutive balanced budgets. Now I think that's pretty effective conservatism. So where are we today? You have a president who is to the left of Jimmy Carter. I mean, Barack Obama is legitimately, and I think this is an important thing to understand about him, he is legitimately a radical in the tradition of rules for radicals and the whole concept of Saul Alinsky, which in fact Obama taught in Southside Chicago. When people say he was a community organizer, he wasn't organizing Boys and Girls Clubs. He was training people to be part of ACORN and other kind of radical groups, and his policies reflect that. And what are the results? He's anti-American energy. He had the highest price of gasoline in history. And we're very vulnerable. I mean, people should be watching what the Iranians are doing in the Straits of Hormuz, practicing closing the straits. I mean, the fact that we do not have an active, aggressive American energy policy is a serious national security problem. The president's anti-job creator. Remember I said earlier 4 parts. The 4th part is you should like people who create jobs. It seems hard for the White House to understand, but class warfare does not encourage people to create jobs. It encourages people to put jobs outside the country. So you have an administration which raises taxes instead of lowering them, which increases regulations instead of lowering them, which is against American energy, and which attacks job creators. Well, that's where we are today. Now, because of my background, we have, if you go to Newt.org, you'll see an entire program. Lower taxes, less regulation, more American energy, favor the people who create jobs. Sound familiar? 3rd time in my lifetime. And it's almost like you cannot get the national establishment to learn these rules. And one of the major differences I have with Governor Romney, who is a fine person, I've said publicly, he is a good manager, he is a competent person, he did very, very well with the Winter Olympics. But there's a huge difference between the philosophy of a supply-side conservative in the Kemp-Reagan tradition and the philosophy of a Massachusetts moderate. I would dramatically cut taxes. And I don't try, by the way, to get into the arguments of the national establishment. If we have 0 capital gains tax cut and we bring hundreds of billions of dollars into the U.S., fact is the people who have capital will be the big winners. But so will every American who gets a job. And let me show you how the left, in the way they analyze things, rigs the game. If you look at a chart, my budget proposals have been analyzed by a liberal group, and they came back and said to their great shock that there's not a very big tax break for the lowest 20%. And they're right, because the lowest 20% doesn't pay any taxes. On the other hand, they refuse to count the number of jobs that would be created. So let's take August of 1983. It's hard to, when you look at the pathetic Obama economy, it's hard to imagine a month where you created 1,300,000 jobs in 1 month. But if you think about it, nobody on the left counts the value of the jobs. So nobody says, how much would the income of unemployed Americans go up if they got an average income job times 1,300,000? All of a sudden you have billions of dollars going into the hands of working Americans who are currently unemployed. Now, you're not going to get in Washington that kind of analysis because they don't think about jobs. They don't think about markets. They don't understand how it works. We have a 12.5% corporate tax rate. We picked it at a very straight level. It's the corporate tax rate of Ireland, and Microsoft files all of its royalties in Ireland for a practical reason. 12.5% is a lot lower than 35. So if we go to 12.5% corporate tax rate, and we're working to make it apply both to Subchapter S and to C Corps, guess what happens? You suddenly liberate about $700 billion in locked up profits overseas to come back home. You suddenly make American companies competitive worldwide. And by the way, Governor Romney's 25% rate is still above the Canadian rate. The Canadian rate is 16. My rate would actually put us better than Canada. You then look at 100% expensing. What does that mean? It means if you're a farmer or a factory or a business, you write off 100% of your investment annually in all new equipment. And why does that matter? Because we want American workers to be the most productive, most creative workers in the world. I want to rebuild our manufacturing base. You cannot be the arsenal of democracy if you don't have an arsenal. You can't stay ahead of China unless you have a massive increase in manufacturing and you apply science and technology, which is why one of my proposals is to actually combine unemployment compensation with a training requirement. So we're not ever again going to give people 99 weeks to do nothing. But if you need the help, we'll give you the help if you'll sign up with a business to get trained during the time we're helping you so that you rebuild the capital, the human capital of the U.S. so you get a better trained workforce, more prepared for modern jobs. So you take new equipment that can be written off every year, and you take new training, and you suddenly have the best equipped, best trained workforce in the world. We'll go back to being the leading economic country in the world and the leading manufacturing country in the world. We also eliminate the death tax for a very practical reason. It's an immoral tax. The death tax says if you do everything right your entire lifetime, you save, you invest, you work, you end up in a situation where politicians can take away your money when you die. No society should require you to visit the undertaker and the IRS the same week. It is fundamentally, profoundly wrong. And if you allow businesses to focus on job creation, because by definition, the people you're talking about are people who are good at creating jobs. I don't want them to be diverted the last 20 years of their life to avoiding taxes. I want them to continue to grow jobs. Finally, for individuals, we create a 15% flat tax as an option. You can keep the current tax code with all of its complexity and all of its deductions, or you can have a very simple one-page form. This is what Hong Kong does, and it's very successful. People who are better off with one page, fill out one page. People who are better off with all the deductions and all the paperwork, keep the deductions. So that's the core model. On deregulation, it's very straightforward. Repeal Obamacare, repeal Dodd-Frank, which is killing small banks and killing small business and crippling the housing industry. And remember, the price of housing in the last month that was announced this morning went down again. We have a continuing deflation in the value of housing, and that means we have a deflation in the wealth of the middle class, and that means that we have people who are in trouble because their mortgage is bigger than their house. Turning that around is a key part of the economy and a key part of where we're going, and repealing Dodd-Frank helps turn that around. I would also repeal